software developer at Monsanto. I've been there for around a year and a half, and before that, I was actually working in the biotech industry. I actually have kind of a unusual tech background. I don't have a traditional schooling, so I've only been doing programming for around 2.5 years. So compared to a lot of you, I might be quite a bit of a greenhorn, but I hope you guys still learn something today. So that's me. That's me as an entry-level developer. And before this, I did a little bit of front-end web development. I went to a coding boot camp, and after I graduated, I learned, I did some freelance work, and I designed some websites. And one of the major sticking points for me is how CSS is kind of a pain in the ass. So I feel like this slide is always kind of obligatory for when you first have a CSS presentation. So who here has used CSS in their day-to-day? Who has a love-hate relationship with CSS? Who hates CSS more than they love it? Okay, well, okay, wow. I'd expect more people to hate it, but that's good. CSS can be really finicky. It can do things. It can seem really brittle sometimes, and part of the reason for that, I feel like, is when CSS was originally designed, it wasn't really designed for the responsive web. People, when they were designing the spec, they weren't thinking about how people would be using them on desktops and phones. They were just thinking about it as a document layout system. So a lot of the pain points can be explained away by the fact that CSS hadn't been given the time to develop properly. And there's technologies today that make it a lot easier to handle. OK, so just some work humor. This is a picture called a Fullstack developer. So it's like a horse that has a really, really pretty back end, but not so pretty front end. And I think I just wanted this slide to show that being a full stack developer is really hard. And there are things that we all kind of slack on and don't put enough time into, even though they would give us a lot better handle on making websites and servers run. One case in point, this is a tweet from Dan Avermov researching something before he did his React comp. And if you guys aren't familiar with Dan Avermov, he's the creator of Redux, a very popular state management library. And he's searching how to center a div using CSS, which I thought was pretty funny. There's 3 takeaways I want you to get out of this talk. Number 1, floats are definitely not the way to do layout in 2018. So this is a picture of a shelf, and there's a can that says load bearing, do not move. And I kind of wanted to use that as kind of analogy for how we're using floats today with CSS. Floats were never designed to be used with a grid-based layout system. The fact that it works is just a hack. And there's much better ways to do it. So today we're going to be talking about Flexbox and CSS Grid. And there are technologies that we can use today without fear in production. Just to prove that to you guys, there's this website called caniuse.com, which shows you the current state of browser compatibility with major web technologies. So in the case of Flexbox, you'll see that over 96% of browsers are able to use Flexbox. And in the case of CSS Grid, over 88% are able to use it today. There's some stragglers like Opera Mini or Samsung Internet 4. There's some, apparently Opera Mini is 2.65% of the internet today. I had no idea. So that was the first thing. Don't use floats. The second thing is I want you to be able to center anything in CSS in 3 lines. You never have to Google it again. And the last point that I want you guys to get out of it is Flexbox and Grid are layout systems that focus on the relationship between parent containers and child items. I'm going to be covering a lot here today, and I really don't expect you guys to be able to absorb everything that you're learning about. It takes practice, but just having these 3 things in mind, hopefully next time you have a layout problem with CSS, you're able to keep these technologies in mind and hopefully find a use for them. Okay, so today we're going to think about the web page as a road. And what I mean by that is if you look at a road from an aerial view, you're constrained by your width rather than your vertical height. So if you think about it like a highway, you can only fit so many cars across, but a nearly infinite amount going vertically. And so if we compare them to web pages, it's kind of the same way. How, like, when you're browsing on your phone, you keep scrolling up, or if you're browsing on the desktop, you're also scrolling up. But the amount of real estate that you're given width-wise can be highly variable. So in this analogy, I want you to imagine yourself as the director for a traveling marching band. And you're responsible for arranging your parade members in a way that is conducive to a marching band. And you have to be able to kind of just navigate all kinds of streets so they can be very wide or very thin. And you want to do it so that the content of the web page doesn't break. So normally, without any styling, if you add paradees to your marching band, they'll just march in line. And that's not really an efficient use of space, right? So so you want them to march in rows. So in order to fix that, you're going to give each paradee. So all of these children, these web elements, are divs with the class paradee. And what we're going to do is we're going to give them the property float, and we're going to give them float left. And what's going to happen is instead of now marching just in a single line, as you add soldiers to the parade, they'll keep marching in rows, in uniform rows. And this is responsive in the sense that if we decrease the size of the road or increase the width of the road, the number of soldiers that fit on each row will accommodate. So this works pretty well, but there's a problem. So if you decide to add something that's not uniform in size, like something bigger, like maybe a car, your layout kind of breaks. So we're going to keep adding soldiers, and then you'll see that there's this weird gap that occurs, and this is because floats are not a good solution for having grid-based layouts. What's happening is the soldier, when it's trying to cross the road, is crashing into the car and stopping, as opposed to kind of making his way all the way to the left side of the road. There's another problem with clearfix, and I apologize. I couldn't replicate this problem on my demo site, so I'm just going to show you with a live code example. So here we have a website with parent and a child, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, where if you if you have a parent div and you have a child element, normally what happens if you have a child that has I'm going to give it a background. red and a height of maybe 300 pixels. And we're going to put styling on the parent. So the parent's going to have a border of 3 pixels. So there's no floats being applied right now. So, 3 pixels solid black. What you'll find is that the parent div is behaving as expected, where the parent is able to fit the contents of the child. Let's actually add another child here. And then child 2. So I'm sorry?
Missing a colon after your background.
Oh, okay.
Background green.
Oh, thank you. So right now they're stacking, so we want them to be side by side, so we're going to apply the property float left on both of them. And what you see is that the parent that was previously enclosing both of the children is now gone. It's kind of shrunken back into place. And this is one of the problems with using floats as a layout system, where you have to use this hack called clearfix and apply it to the parent container. In order to restore the expected behavior of the parent enclosing both of the children. So hopefully those 2 examples alone were able to show you guys that floats weren't designed with grid-based layouts in mind, and there's actually better solutions today. So in 2018, ever since the mid-2010s, essentially, we've had better ways to do layout. So Flexbox and CSS Grid are the technologies that we're going to talk about, and they're all, what I want to stress to you guys is they're all about the parent container and the immediate direct children of the container. Oh, by the way, guys, I forgot to mention, if you guys have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'd love to, if I explain something poorly, I'd love the chance to correct myself, and I'd love to hear your guys' feedback as well. So previously, when we were dealing with the floats, we were applying essentially directions to each of the children to how we were telling each of the children how to position themselves. But with CSS Grid and Flexbox, we're taking that responsibility away from the children and giving a directive to the parent container, and the parent container is going to now size the elements. So we're going to take that parade that we just had earlier, and we're going to, instead of having the float method, we're going to replace it with a Flexbox implementation. So the way that we do that is we take the float property off the children. So we're going to go back to the block-based layout. And then we're going to take, so there's a parent class called road. I'm going to add another parent class called conductor, just to make a better analogy. And we're going to put that parent conductor class on the parent. And we're going to do display flex, flex wrap, and let's do justify content space. All right, so now as we add soldiers to the parade, it's behaving normally as it should. with the added benefit of these soldiers, instead of having a gap, a margin at the end, a gap of empty space at the end that wasn't uniform, we have a wrapping row of soldiers. And now, when we add the car, the layout no longer breaks. So, and it doesn't break no matter how many cars there are. And the reason it doesn't break is that Flexbox knows that in this row there is an element that is larger than any other of the other child elements, and it spaces it accordingly. So the advantage gained by Flexbox and CSS Grid is that the parent containers are now aware of the quantity and the size of its children, and you no longer need things like clearfix, and row height will automatically adjust to fit the largest element. So how does Flexbox work? So I just put like a bunch of properties here, right? I did display, flex, wrap, justify content, space evenly. That by itself doesn't really make sense. So I'm going to take all the properties off except flex and kind of give you a breakdown of what's happening. All right, so right away, when you put the property display flex on a parent container, what happens is the parent container turns into a flex container, and all of the immediate children turn into flex items. Flex items will position themselves according to the primary axis, which is an invisible line that spans either from left to right, or it can span top to bottom. So you'll see, we can actually change, oh, sorry, this is pretty finicky. We can actually change the direction of the primary axis, the main axis. So right now the main axis is left to right. So as we add soldiers, they're going to go left to right, but we can use the property flex direction to change it from left to right to top to bottom. So as we add soldiers now, the flex direction is column. So now the soldiers go from left, instead of left to right, we're going top to bottom. All right. So once we've set that main axis, we can do some cool things. So as we add a soldier, let's set it back to row. And let's remember that the main axis is going this way. We can position the flex items based on that main axis with the property justify content. So if we do justify content, we have a variety of options. So we can do flex start, which doesn't do anything because we're starting at the beginning of the main axis. But there's also, conversely, there's something called flex end, which positions the item at the end of the main axis. There's also something called center. And what it'll do is it'll take the flex item and position in the center. And as we add soldiers to that flex container, the items will make it so that the free space is totally put around the flex items. And there's also space around, which takes the free space of that axis and puts it around the flex items, and space evenly, which is basically like space around, but it's a little hard to explain, so I'm going to kind of skip it for now. So right now, we've been focusing primarily on the main axis, but we can also position across the cross axis, which you do with align items. I'm just going to draw an arrow just to show you guys what I'm talking about. And I'm going to make it blue. And I'm going to, right now, the height of the container is determined by the size of the flex items. So I'm going to increase the size of the container just a little bit. So I'm going to set a height of 300 pixels. And right now, what you'll see is the flex item has sized itself to stretch across the entirety of the free space, so across the cross axis. You can actually change that, and you can position the flex item across the cross axis with the property align items. And so we can do align item center, and what that'll do is take your flex item and center it. So that's how you actually position something, center something in 3 lines of CSS. You do display flex, justify content you can do space evenly or center, and align item center, and that mystery is solved forever. Congratulations. There's actually a really cool game that you can actually practice alignment with. I have to get this cursor away. It's called Flexbox Froggy. Have you guys heard of it? So what the point of this game is, you take a frog and you essentially try to get it back on its lily pad. And the idea is that the whole entire container is a flex container. And right now, the main axis is like this, and the cross axis, this is really finicky, I'm sorry, guys. Well, you get the point. So the main axis is crosswise, so if you want if the frog to get to the end, you do justify content, flex, end, and there's a whole series of puzzles. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So there's also align items. So if you want these frogs to go to the end here, knowing that the main axis is crosswise and the cross axis is top to bottom, you could do align items, flex, end, and the froggies are back home. There's 24 levels. I'd highly recommend giving it a shot. Did I close my slides? No, we're good. Okay. So what I haven't addressed is what happens when so I'm going to take these justify content and align items off. What I haven't addressed is what happens when the soldier reaches the end of the parent container with just flex. So what happens is, as we add soldiers, the soldiers no longer fit into the parent container anymore. And by default, flex will not wrap your items. So what you need to do is do display flex, and then flex, wrap, wrap. And that'll fix your problem. And what's happening is that once the flex items cause it need to wrap, what's happening is you're actually getting a second axis of alignment. So there's one. The opacity is really messing up now. There. And there. And you have a second axis. You'll see this more readily apparent when you have space along the cross-axis. I'm going to do that real quick. Close this. So we're going to put a height on the road. Oh, oops. And you'll see that instead of immediately following, instead of having that the soldiers wrap immediately at the bottom of the right next to each other, you're going to see that the flex items have actually kind of spaced themselves apart. And what's happened, so if you were to visualize it, what you're seeing is you're actually seeing two axes. So the flex container has split into two axes of alignment. So there's 1 and 2. And if you do align items and center, you'll see that the items, oh, sorry, I have to add the soldiers again. But instead of having them both in the center, they're centered based on that split flex container. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. When it splits into 3. So add a third row. And so it's aligned across the cross-axis, but there's now 3 axes. One thing to note is what's really confusing about Flexbox is the fact that when you change the direction of your main axis, what justify content do and align items do switches. So justify content doesn't always refer to positioning items across the x-axis, and align items doesn't always mean positioning items across the y-axis. So just to drive that point home, let's give it a shot. So let's do flex direction column, and you'll see that, oh, did I do something wrong? Oh, it didn't save. Okay. Let's get rid of that height so we don't have that problem. Oh, if you set the height, you're also going to run into this problem of flex items overrunning the container when you set the flex direction to column. So if we do flex wrap now, you'll see that it's doing that same thing where it's going to split into two axes of alignment, and so on and so forth. But what I was trying to address earlier was the fact that justify content will no longer refer to centering across the x-axis, and now it refers to centering across the y-axis. So that's a gotcha. Oh, yep.
Any thoughts about the names that they picked for these properties? It seems like it could have been much more understandable. They did it good on some. Like you've got flex wrap and flex direction. Maybe justify content should have been called flex major, and align item should have been flex minor.
I totally agree.
What's really annoying is for people that like to alphabetize their properties, now they're scattered all over because they don't all start with flex, and align items comes first.
That's a really good point, but unfortunately I'm not on the W3C committee, so it's something that we have to live with. What's nice is once you start using CSS Grid, justify content and align items won't switch around anymore. Okay, so now that we've talked about flex wrap, let's see. Let's talk about the properties that we can put on the flex items instead of the flex container. So Flexbox isn't only responsible for sizing, positioning elements, but it can also be used for sizing elements. And in order to size elements, instead of putting the properties on the parent container, we're now individually sizing elements, the flex items. So one of them is called flex, just flex. And what that does is, let's see, let's switch examples for a second. We're actually going to abandon the parade analogy. I'm sorry, I couldn't really think of a good way to carry on that analogy as I was working on this presentation, so rip. So we're going to go to this playground, and what this playground does is it just adds, there's a parent container, and in this parent container, every time I click add element, it's just adding another flex item to the parent container. And we're going to apply the property display flex on the parent container. And we're going to, for each of the children, we're going to give it a background color. Does anybody have a favorite background color? Cyan. Cyan, okay. Cyan, it's going to be super bright. And we're going to actually, let's make it, the numbers a little more visible. We're going to do font size 3M. And so another thing is you can actually apply flex properties to, you can make flex items into flex containers. So I'm going to do that real quick. So flex, and I'm just going to center the numbers just by contact line. Center. Oh, and let's give them a little bit of padding as well. Oh, but then the parent container is way too small, so I'm just going to get rid of the parent. Oh, but I need an absolute width for the parent container. So let's make it a little bigger. Okay, so now we have 4 blocks, and we're going to size one of the blocks with the flex property. So we're going to do, so each of these children has an ID that just corresponds to its number. So in the case of child 1, the ID is child 1. And we're going to give it the property flex and 1. And you'll see that, oh, let's actually give them all a border too, just to make it a little more clear where the boundaries are. 1 px dotted red. Okay, so what you saw here is the elements 2, 3, 4 are sized normally, and the last element, the first element, rather, the first child has expanded to fill in the rest of the way. So how flex grow works, or the flex property works, it's actually a combination of flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, but that's a little too much for this presentation, so I'm going to kind of gloss over it. It looks at the available free space. So I'm going to take this off real quick, and distributes the remaining space to the flex grow property. So if you have flex 1 and no other flex properties on the other children, it's going to take up the remaining space. What's interesting is if you give another child on that row the flex property, let's give it flex 2. Oh, what did I do? Oh, no colon. You'll see that child number 2 is actually a lot bigger than child 1. And what's happening here is that flex is still distributing the even space, but now child 2 is growing at a rate twice as fast as child 1. So this is really useful if you want an element to span across your entire array without using widths, percentages, because sometimes percentages can be a little messy, because when you're dealing with like borders, and this is just another way of sizing your elements. Another cool property is called order. And right now, you'll see that in the DOM, I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's, let's see, oh, that might be better. There's 3 children, right? And it's child 1, 2, 3, and they're flowing left to right. But you can actually change the order that these elements appear without changing your HTML, which is something you previously required JavaScript to do. So in order to do this, we can use the property order. And let's actually make another selector with the rule for child 3. And I'm going to give child 3 order 1, child 2 order 1, and child 1 order 3. And by putting that order property on each of the children, we've actually rearranged how they display on the DOM, which is really nice.
Is that considered like a bad thing to do? Just practice?
It can be for accessibility, for sure. This might sound bad, but I haven't really designed a lot of sites around accessibility, so I'm not really sure.
It can be a good thing for accessibility too, where you can put like navigation after in the DOM, but then place it up above
Okay.
in the actual render.
I've also seen it used with media queries where when it gets to a certain breakpoint, it rearranges so it'll collapse, but it'll collapse in the correct order. But they want the nav to drop to the bottom or move up or whatever. They're using media queries with that order property to just rearrange the page when it gets to certain breakpoints.
Okay.
But yeah, don't use the sort of list.
Right.
Right.
Okay, perfect. All right, so those are all the things that I wanted to talk about Flexbox. So if it's all right with you guys, I thought we could do like a short demo showing off all these properties all at once. So we're going to make a login screen, and our UI designer created this amazing login screen for this fake company where you have a portrait mode and a landscape mode. So we're going to use media queries to kind of be able to render both. So the first point of order is that the company name's kind of terrible. So does anybody have an idea for a better name for a company? Just a fake company? Any takers? jSTL. All right, perfect. All right, so we've actually created the outline of that website already, but there's no styling. And right now there's a header here. We have our portrait, that's way too small here. And then we have our form data here. And the parent container is called login. So let's start by applying the property flex on the parent container. What that'll do is it messes everything up. So we don't want it to flow left to right. We want to let it flow top to bottom. So we'll set the flex direction to column. So we're right back where we started. But the advantage is if we set a height to this login page, we're going to set the height to 100 view height. We can actually center it now. So we do align items, center, or that should have worked. Height, display flex. Oh, I forgot that the main axis has changed to the cross axis. or what was the cross-axis. So instead of align items, it is now justify content. Center. And now the content is centered. Does anybody have a favorite background color? What? I'm sorry? C. Oh, FFEE. Okay, perfect. Coffee. All right, classic. And let's set the width to 100 view width as well. All right, it's looking good. Now let's make sure that the portrait is large enough. So let's set a height to the portrait container. View height, maybe a little more. Let's put a margin at the top. And let's give it another background color. If we're doing puns, there's bad ass. And we can give it a border radius of 30. Oh. It's probably not what we want. Let's give it width 30 view. Oh. Okay, so now that we've trimmed the size of the portrait container so that we can get a perfect circle, now it's centered all the way to the left, which is not what we want. So in order to justify, so right now the main axis is down, up, and the cross axis is left to, left to right. So in order to center this, we have to do align items center. Oh, I forgot to set the name of the company as well. So let's do that real quick. All right. I think, let's actually give it a little more. All right, so now the emoji that we had as the icon is a little too far up. So we can actually, what we talked about before, we can put the flex property on the portrait container. So the flex item can in turn become a flex container. So let's do that real quick. Flex and align items center, justify content center. And let's just make the portrait a little bigger. So size to 10. All right, looking okay. All right, the only thing we need to do now, I think, is just put a little margin top on the login container here. So margin top, 10 VH, and we have a passable login screen. All right, so now, but what we want is when it's a landscape mode to kind of take more advantage of the entire screen. So in order to do that, we're going to use media queries. So right now, the width of the container is around 900 pixels when it's like this. So let's make a breakpoint at 901 pixels. So we can now do display set of, and let's put in the login, the main container, let's revert our flex direction, the direction of our main axis from top to bottom to left to right. So login. Let's see if that works. No. Okay. So now we want, so now when the page gets wider, the flex direction changes from top to bottom to left to right. According to our diagram, though, we noticed that we want the login form to be in the middle, not at the right. So what's the flex property that we need to use to correct this? I'm sorry? Order. Yeah. So in order to do that, we're going to set the login form. So hashtag login form. And we're going to just put order. Actually, we're going to have to put one on every one of these just to keep the flow. So title, login form. So, oh, we don't really need that. So we're going to set the order of the login form to 2, and the title to 1, and the portrait container to 3. And we got ourselves a passable login screen. I think you guys get the point. It's just you can create some cool responsive designs with Flexbox using media queries. And that's about it. Any questions? All right. All right, so I'm going to take a 5-minute break, if that's okay with you guys. And feel free to come up and talk to me. I just want some, use the restroom real quick. So I'll be right back. Okay, so should I? Oh, am I?
Go.
Oh, wait, is this on? Okay, we're good. Oh, thank you. So now that we've talked about Flexbox, now we're going to talk about CSS Grid. CSS Grid is like so cool, but I haven't used it much in production, so there's probably going to be a lot of spots in my knowledge. I'm just kind of using this as like a platform to show you kind of what it's capable of and how much cruft it removes. So bear with me. Yeah. Okay, so Flexbox is one-dimensional. What does that even mean? When I first heard that, I was like super confused because like if it's one-dimensional, that means it's just like a point, right? But I kind of like describing why Flexbox is one-dimensional by kind of showing you what it can't do, which there's a lot of things that Flexbox can't do that CSS Grid can do, and that's because it's two-dimensional. So we're going to just get started on that. Okay, so what is CSS Grid? CSS Grid allows you to take a parent container and essentially slice and dice it into many little mini containers called grids. Cells. So the way you start with CSS Grid is you take a parent container. So let me just go here. So we have a parent container. Let's, instead of calling it grid area, let's call it parent. And we're going to give it actually, we're not going to give it any height at the beginning. So right now, there's just a parent container with nothing in it. It just has this display grid. And what we're going to do is we're going to define a series of rows and columns. The way you do that is by using grid template rows. And we're going to say that, or let's start with columns rather. So grid template columns, we're going to start with 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. And grid template rows, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. And what that will do, it will size the container. Oh, that shouldn't look like that probably. Let's look at that again. Not sure. I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out why. Oh, it's because the class name isn't unique enough. So I'm just going to call it parent X, just so it doesn't clash with the styling that's already existing on the page. So, and we're going to give it a border of 5px solid black. Still happening. Sorry about that. Put in another div. Maybe that'll do it. All right, what should be happening is that there should be a box that's 300 pixels wide and 300 pixels tall, but for whatever reason, Flexbox isn't wanting to cooperate with me, so I'm going to kind of cheat, and I'm going to do something called 1FR, 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 and now it doesn't want to. Okay, sorry. Okay, and now we have a box that spans the entirety of the container that has 3 rows and 3 columns. The rows are 100 pixels tall, and the columns are 1 fraction wide. And what that fractional unit means is that it calculates the available free space in the container column-wise, so x-axis-wise, and then it distributes fractionally. So if you have 1FR, 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 that means there's 3 fractions. So it's saying distribute one fraction to the first column, the second fraction to the second column, and third fraction to the third column. You can kind of mix it up by adding another, doing something like 2FR, and you'll see that the width of the second column is now twice as large as the first column and the third column. And this is pretty cool, but I also lost my train of thought. So what this allows you to do is you've now essentially cordoned off your parent container into a series of little containers. And now whenever you add an element to the parent container, let's add a child, and let's give it a background, Rebecca purple, and you'll see that the child takes up the first cell of the grid container. And as we add more children, you'll see that it flows from left to right, top to bottom. And what's really cool about this is the fact that you can now essentially size your elements based on the grid, the rows and templates of the columns that you've defined, and you can also position them. So I have this quick demo. We're gonna recreate a board of Battleship, and what this this grid container has is it's a set height and width, which I couldn't do before, and we're going to give it a display of grid. And if you ever played Battleship, the board is comprised of 10 columns and 10 rows. So in order to split this grid evenly, we're going to give it a grid 10 rows and 10 columns. So we're gonna use this function called a repeat function. So repeat, and then what this does is it takes a pattern and repeats it X number of times. So what we want to do in this case is repeat this 1FR 10 times. So this is the equivalent of 1FR, 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 but we're not going to write that all out. And then we're going to give it the same thing for the rows. Repeat 10, 1FR. And what you'll see is when we use Firefox DevTools, you can see that the container has now been split into 10 columns and 10 rows, creating 100 cells. And what's really cool about CSS Grid is now you can use these grid lines that have been created to precisely position your elements without having any sort of spacer. So if you ever played the game of Battleship, you know there's several pieces and they're all different sizes. So we're just going to use this as a kind of a cheat sheet. And we're going to create 5 child elements in the grid. So we're going to make carrier, battleship, ship, sub, destroyer, and patrol. Okay, so now there's 5 child elements, and we're going to give them each a color. So let's give the carrier black. color background black, the battleship, battle dash ship rather, background green, the sub, back color of red, and the destroyer background of cyan, and the patrol a background of purple. No, we didn't use purple. Okay. So all the 5 pieces are there, but they're not sized or positioned correctly. So using Firefox DevTools, you can actually overlay the grid, and you can see all these lines that are called track lines. And we can use them to precisely position and size each of these. So let's say I want to take the carrier, which has a length of 5, and I want it to be right here. So if we look at the column where it starts at, the line where it starts at 4, right? And maybe we should have a little more contrast on that, now that I think about it. Here. Let's try this. Okay. Just so it's a little more clear. So it starts at 4, and it ends at 9. So, and then it also starts at row 4 and ends at row 5. So in order to position this carrier, we can do grid column start 4, which is right here, and then grid column end, which is right here. So we positioned it horizontally on the x-axis. Let's position it on the y-axis. So we can do grid row start 4 and grid row end 5. What that should do is once we get rid of this little block, we can see that the battleship has moved to the position that we specified, which is something that wasn't previously possible with CSS. Previously, you had to have elements that acted as spacers to kind of position it where you wanted to. But now you can just position and size it directly. But writing grid column start, grid column end, row start, row ends, kind of like a lot of work, right? We're programmers. We want to be lazy. Let's think of an easier way to write it. So let's now position the battleship in a shortened way. So let's bring back the grid, and let's say we want the position of the battleship to be starting here and ending here. I'm just going to give it a little more pop. Okay, so that means it starts at row 4 and it spans to row 8. So in order to do, the shorthand for this would be grid row and then 4/8, which is a lot easier to write than grid row start and end with each of their numbers. And then we see that it spans the column 10 to column 11. So we could do grid column 10 to 11. And now we see that the battleship is positioned right there. I'm just going to do one more because I feel like it's a little redundant to do all of them. I'm going to position the sub, and let's say that the sub is actually from positioned here to here. Or so now we see that it starts from column 2 and spans to row 5. And then column 2 to column 5 rather, and row 6 to row 7. So I'm going to write it even more shorthand. So we can just do grid row 6 and grid column. And let's say we didn't even want to figure out that it was column 5. We could just do 2/span 3. And now, which is what's happening, right? Because it's spanning 3 blocks to here. And you can easily see, hey, what's up? Oh, no.
Can I use like CSS variable or like com to like control where
Yeah, you can actually do that. That's what I'm going to talk about next, and I think it's super cool. So, yep.
How does it react if you specify numbers that take it outside of your?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Let's find out. All right. So this battleship is at the very edge, right? So let's do grid column 10 to 13. And nothing happened. I don't know. Yeah. I'm sorry? 11 to 13. It just disappears. Okay. Do you guys want to position another one, or do you guys want to move on?
One thing I wanted to point out,
Yeah.
it might not be obvious,
Yeah.
is that these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can actually overlap them.
All right.
It's very
That's very.
How does order take place?
well, it's using the default, since they all have default Z order, it just stacks them up in order, like, of definition. So where the elements are in the block, yeah. But you can use the ordering to like change what the stack is.
So that would take place as Z order or something like that?
Yeah.
Z-index?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. I didn't know that, so thank you. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to cover in this presentation is what I think is the coolest thing. It's called grid template areas. And what grid template areas allows you to do is essentially assign variable names to certain areas of the grid and then use just that variable name to size and position your elements. And this is really useful when you're creating a responsive website. So that's what we're going to do real quick. So I'm going to use like has anybody ever read this article? This was written in 2010 by Ethan Marcotte, and it was like basically the seminal article for responsive web design. So I'm just going to steal his version of like what a responsive website should be. So you'll see that this website, when you, this won't work without not going full screen, but you'll see that as the site collapses, a bunch of the web elements just move around, right? So we're just going to make like a very crude version of this website. It's called Responsive Web Design by Ethan Marcotte. It's on alistapart.com. And he made this Sherlock Holmes website. And you'll see that in this website you have a sidebar, you have a nav, you have a blurb, essentially, you have an image gallery, and you have a footer. So let's kind of try to recreate this format. With CSS Grid, if we can. So if you think about it, it looks like Control Shift W. Oh, I think I closed all of them by accident. My bad. All right. So if we go back to that grid that we had earlier, I'd say that this column takes up maybe like 25% of the screen, and there are 4 rows. The top row takes up like 15%. The second row takes up maybe 30, and the footer takes up the rest. So let's just mock that out with grid. So here, I'm going to get rid of all the children for a second. And we're going to give it display grid, and we're going to give it 2 columns, so 15%. I'm going to get rid of this, and 1 FR, and let's say 10%, 30%, 1 FR, 15%.
So does 1 FR sort of jump in for auto?
Yeah, or you could use auto. Either one's fine. And
Think of FR as fraction of the remaining space.
all right.
Think of it as fractional unit, the remaining space.
Right. And let's actually give it a height of 100% just so that it doesn't break. So now you'll see that we've made the grid into, let's actually make this 25%, just make it a little wider. So you have the sidebar, what could be the sidebar. So if we were to kind of like overlay the site, oh, whoops. Snappy. Sorry. I'm just gonna cheat a little bit. You could see that this could be here, this could be here, this could be here, and this could be here. So the way that what you can do in Flexbox is use this property called, CSS Grid rather, grid template areas, and assign individual variable names to each of the areas. So right now we have a 4x2 grid. So here we could do, and this is weird because it's kind of like ASCII. So you do header, and I'll just save that now. Oh, forgot the colon. And you'll see that like in the dev tools, this area called header pulls up. And then you could do, and then right next to the header was the nav, right? So you could do nav. And then we're going to make a new row. Since there's a new row, we've used up all the space of the top row. And we could say, there's nothing here, right? There's nothing here in this website. So we can put a dot. And then we could say content. I like to line them up. So if we put content here, you'll see that there's content here. And then we have another empty space, and then we have the gallery. And for the last row, we have a footer. So all the grid template areas have been assigned. So let's now just make the corresponding web elements for each of them. So here we're going to make a header, a nav, content, call content, gallery. Oh, should have done this ahead of time in retrospect. And a footer. Oh, what broke? Uh-oh. Oh, nothing broke. It's just there's nothing there. Okay, so now what we can do is we have a header class, right? So we can assign header of color, let's say background green, and a grid area. And then we just type in header. And when we save, you'll see that the CSS element, the header element has taken up the size and position of where you specified the header would be. And then you could continue on with the other ones. So nav, background of royal blue, and grid area of nav. And then content, background, Rebecca purple, grid area, content, and gallery, background of, give me a color. Corn silk. Okay. I'm not sure if that'll show up well. Oh. I think it's fine. Goldenrod? Okay. Goldenrod. Perfect. And grid area of gallery. And footer grid area of footer. Background, please. Chartreuse. Okay, perfect. All right, so you can see that the position elements have sized themselves accordingly. And now I'm going to show you what I think is the coolest part. So right now, the width of the page is, oh, that's not helpful. Let's say we're going to make some breakpoints. Let's just say that. So we're going to make a breakpoint max width 600 pixels. And we're going to kind of follow the flow of this website. So you'll see that as we close it down, the nav bar actually navigates to the sidebar, and the content gets larger. So let's replicate that behavior. So actually, I'm going to zoom out a little bit if I can. I can't, so we're kind of stuck. But we have the content gallery. So we could say that we want the parent to now have a grid. We can redefine the parent to have a grid template, column. Oh, we can actually keep the grid template as it is, actually, now that I think about it. We're going to change the grid rows. Grid template rows, and we do, let's say, 40%, 1FR. And we're also going to reassign our grid template areas. So we're no longer a 2x4 format. we are now a 2x3 format. So we're going to get rid of the nav. We're going to reposition it here. Actually, no, that doesn't. Content. Actually, I'm just going to start from scratch, actually. Sorry. So we have the header. We have the content. We have the nav. And we have the gallery. And then we have empty space. And then we have the footer. And now what happens, what should happen, I hope I didn't mess this up, is once we've saved it, as you shrink this page, and I did mess it up, it should have reformatted to that structure. Let me try to. Okay, I actually have a backup for this, so I'm going to cheat. Okay, so what should have happened is something like this, where you have nothing about the sizing of the individual elements changes. So the content header and nav always have the grid area of footer, but you just change how the grid area is laid out. And based off of that, you have a totally responsive website that shifts its elements based on the breakpoints, based on these variables that you've assigned. And I think that's super cool. And that's about it. Any questions?
I feel like with Flexbox and Grid, the CSS insertion point where you don't just hit it, I think it's like really inadequate.
I think it's
You think it's less brittle now?
I'm sorry?
You think it's like less brittle now?
Yeah, I think it's a lot better. It's kind of like a revelation once you start using it.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
So I know like most browsers are like support this, but there are always cases where it doesn't get supported.
Mm-hmm.
What's the failsafe in that case?
What's the failsafe?
Or is there any
I haven't really been like. There's polyfills for Flexbox. I know IE10 and Edge support it. Supports CSS Grid, but I think you always just design mobile first. And if you design mobile first, then you know your website's going to be okay, and then you add CSS Grid on top of it to make it more a better user experience for people that are on desktops or other screens.
Yeah, there's a really great resource. Well, there's two names you're going to hear a lot of in CSS Grid. I'm sure you're familiar with Rachel Andrew and Ben Simmons, kind of the novices of CSS and CSS Grid. Rachel Andrew has a section on her site that is CSS Grid patterns with defaults. And so she gives you common layouts and then gives you like float-based layouts if you can't do CSS Grid. But she tells you CSS Grid can do things that you literally couldn't do before. So if you're looking for like a pixel-perfect fallback to something, you're not going to get it. But it will at least give you a close approximation of the original layout. But really, if you're designing for an evergreen browser, with the exception of some edge cases for older IE, like 10.11, Grid is incredibly well supported. And unlike Flexbox, Grid was rolled out like pretty much simultaneously to all the evergreen browsers, and their support is pretty much equivalent across the board. And to answer your question, yeah, it made me not freaking hate CSS. I've been hating CSS a long time.
All right. That's cool. Also, there's some amazing resources online in addition to what you've mentioned. Yeah, Grid by example. And if you guys ever heard of Westboss, he has 2 free tutorials on cssgrid.io and flexbox.io. I'd really suggest taking a look at them if you want more practice using Flexbox and CSS Grid. That's where the majority of my information came from. And they're really enjoyable, and it's completely free. So check it out if you can. And yep.
So whenever you read the grid, I think this is the way it works, and I'm just checking to make sure. So on the header that you had on the first example,
Yeah.
there was a green box.
Yeah.
You put dots down there, but it looks like the length of it extended past the 10 or 15% that it was for the tab. So if you put header in and replace the first dot, I think you can extend that into that part of the grid.
Yes, you could. And, yep.
What are you using to draw like the arrows and stuff?
Oh, it's this really cool tool called Snappy. I love it. It's free on OS X. I'd highly recommend it.
Oh, I did want to point out a thing. Did you like grid template area
Yeah.
so much? You absolutely should. It's awesome.
Yeah.
There's one additional shorthand syntax that you can use with the grid template areas. It's really, really valuable. It's kind of the way, if I'm doing that kind of layout with grid,
Mm-hmm.
I go this one step further. All of the row and column layouts, like the measurements of each row and column, you can combine that with the layout
Mm-hmm.
in a shorthand property called grid template. So literally with one property,
Yeah.
you can lay out your entire like structure of your web page.
Okay.
And it reads very, very clean. You can look at it and at one glance see where everything is, how big everything is, all at one time. Really, really neat. Grid template.
Okay. I have to check it out. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you.
Thank you.